architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode, we have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture, life, and design thinking, even if these are controversial terms. Today, I have with me Catharina Manchanda, who is the curator of contemporary art here at the Seattle Art Museum. And we will try and talk to her about her work with the museum, the city, and potentially its connections with architecture and design thinking. But Catharina, I know from earlier conversations with you, you don't like the word design.
I'm not very fond of design, but it has more to do with the colloquial use of the term design, rather than the critical and intellectual thrust you probably bring to it. But in the curatorial world, when people talk about a show that is designed, there is an understanding that the design element, that is the container and the frameworks, are very visible, and that has a tendency to kind of diminish sometimes the way in which we see the art.
So design versus what?
I don't know if there's an easy antidote. I mean, it's curatorial work, it's a way in which you want to present the work that is sensitive to, the aesthetics that an artist brings to the table. I don't have a good alternative. I can only tell you that design is somehow a term I shy away from. Okay,
so I get the sense that by design you mean something in the realm of posed or sort of staged in a overtly and uncomfortably self-conscious manner. So let's move away from the word design. Let's just pretend that the right word is architecturalized. as connected to articulated. And I'm very curious about that as curator.
Well, I mean, there is no such thing as, an invisible hand. There is always a constructive and thoughtful element that goes into the mounting of an exhibition. So in a way, you could say you can pick any number of terms. It's complicated because, of course, there is a design element into everything that, right. Every choice that you're making. But as a curator, I don't think of myself as designing as an exhibition, but I think of myself as curating an exhibition.
So talk to us about that. I mean, obviously, you curate the show in terms of, you're selecting certain artworks and you're bringing them into some kind of an art dialogue, I presume. Tell us a little bit more about, once you have the artwork and you have a designated space, let's say in the museum, which is an empty box at that point, how do you go from a collection to an actual show? I mean, how is that architecturalized?
Well, there's two different approaches. First of all, one is, I wish you started with a plain white box that you could configure, any which ways. But of course, the architecture already has a language of its own. The ceiling height, the width of the walls, and then how you can compartmentalize the space. I do a rough draft, if you will, a sketch for an exhibition.
So on a computer, you sort of do a layout. You call it layout. Mm-hmm. And then you give it to your exhibitions and design department, and they sort of detail it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth. Yeah. And, what's maybe extremely different from architecture, once you start building, I don't think you can make any changes. And in an exhibition, I mean, you have to set in stone where your walls are. There's certain architectural elements that have to be really set. But what I often find is, even with the best models and plans, you sometimes walk into space, and once all the works are in the space, you might still want to tweak things. You might to move a few things and adapt them, because you can only see things when you're actually in the space.
Now, of course, most paintings, one way or the other, have space in them. I mean, it's not like paintings are flat. and there is already, I would say, an architectural presence in them. Okay?
That's true. Yeah, absolutely.
Is it interesting to bring that the architectural space of a painting into dialogue with its presentational space?
Yes, I mean, it really depends. I mean, there is what you're alluding to, kind of a history of illusionism that, that is really a pictorial space that you as a viewer, you stand in front of and you can kind of imagine and see in front of you unfold. But it's interesting what you say about the presentation of the artwork as a kind of physical or architectural entity, because as part of our display in the permanent collection right now, a display called Big Picture, there's a whole room with artwork from the 60s and 70s, where the artist think about surface tension and also the painting as a physical object. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have works in there by, say, Joe Baer, fantastic artist who studied right here at the University of Washington, although she studied biology, is extremely famous, was this year at the Whitney Biennial, and I think she's in her 80s at this point in time. And in the early 70s, she made these paintings that, when you think of a painting, you don't think about how deep a painting is, right? You think maybe
literally, it's
literally the depth, right?
The thickness of its frame and the thickness of its canvas and its mounting.
So usually that's like, let's say, 2 inches roughly or thereabouts. Yeah. You don't think much about the actual frame of it. But she built paintings that function partially as sculptures because they were much deeper, let's say 10 inches deep, and she painted them on all 3 sides, the front and the 2 sides. So
what about the back?
Well, the back hangs on the wall, so you can't lift that one up.
It could be a transparent wall, an acrylic wall. Well, it could hang in the middle of space.
Oh, fabulous. Well, you could... I love the creativity of that design, but again, this was not kind of intended by the artist, so I think that's why we rarely see transparent walls in art museums, although it's a great...
Well, you do see some recently... Well, there are lately there are these kind of projection shows which are done on translucent screens which are put in the middle of rooms, which you can see from one side or the other. There seems to be a spatial proposition in museums currently.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for video, absolutely. But I thought we were talking about painting.
Sure,
so in painting, it's rare that an artist wants you to see kind of the inside and back of a painting.
Really? Is there no artist who has ever painted in the back?
Yes, there have been. And that was more of a... also in the 60s, conceptual, deconstructive impulse to kind of turn the surface of the canvas away from you and show you the back. So yes, that has happened, but then you don't see the front because a painting tends to be hanging on the wall. There are exceptions to that rule too. I mean, some people have piled up paintings on the floor, but then they become kind of sculptural objects.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, let's shift that. I mean, we're not just paintings. Museums show everything. Museums show sculpture. Museums show multimedia shows. Museums try to be actively multidisciplinary.
On every level. I mean, performance, music. And I mean, if you look at contemporary art, the great thing about contemporary art is that everything is under development. So unlike artists of the past, people who have already passed away, through the lens of history, it's always easy to see what is important and what falls by the wayside. The exciting thing about contemporary art is, there are risks involved. And on part of the artist, certainly also on part of curators or institutions. But you're trying to find those artists whose work has a strong resonance in our contemporary moment in time. I mean, you talked about McQueen earlier. There is a very strong...
Alexander McQueen, the fashion designer.
Alexander McQueen. So very strong resonance in the way in which he kind of collides materials, brings them together in a fashion show or in a display. I mean, he's somebody who thinks very artistically, and... as you know, multidisciplinary in approach. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, even until very recently, an artist trained to be either a painter or they trained to be a sculptor, or very medium specific. But in the contemporary art world, artists use any material that helps them visualize or express the idea that they want to express. And so for that reason, museums definitely are embracing and reacting to all of that. So yes, a museum too is becoming a very multidisciplinary place.
So as a curator, I'm interested, you've mentioned, trying to be and ensuring that you are maintain fidelity to the artist's intention for the work in its display. And then there is a curatorial aspect of assembling a body of work, which could be, chronological or sort of a life story, but alternately could be composite from various artists, and then there's a story being told amongst them.
Right.
Or I suppose a curatorial work could be actively authorial, where you say, look, I'm using the artwork to tell a story which is well beyond a story of our times, let's say, or a story that's critical of let's say, contemporary politics, to take an easy topic. I mean, how do you see your curatorial role?
Well, that depends too. I mean, the kind of last scenario that you're outlining would perhaps apply most to an exhibition that's thematic, right? You pick a theme and you're trying to make a case. I mean, and really that does happen. I mean, there are perhaps we are all following artists for sometimes a number of years, right? And all of a sudden there's this realization, here's a topic that really needs to be explored. Mm-hmm. And then you might have, multimedia work, and you're starting to build on that. You're starting to kind of develop a checklist for what that would look like. And in that sense, then the relationships that you're trying to then establish within a room, within artworks in a room, is certainly very strongly linked to your curatorial vision. Right. So in that sense, I think those are the kinds of shows, of course, that curators are especially invested in.
Are you especially invested in this?
Well, yeah, I mean, from topic to topic, absolutely.
Give me an example of you say, thematic show that you're doing or have done or planning to do.
Or under development. I mean, there's like an exhibition that I've been calling All Eyes on You.
All Eyes on You.
All Eyes on You. And this is something that hasn't been realized, but could be, and has to do with both our contemporary culture, social media, the way in which we're all constantly looking at each other, mm-hmm. in relationship to the way in which artists, especially I would say in the last 20, 25 years, have been focusing on the spectator, on people looking at something.
So we are into the politics of vision. We are back to Las Meninas.
In a ways, you're going all the way back to a very traditional topic, but there are artists who've cast it in very interesting ways, in contemporary culture.
Well, the politics of vision.
To video, to any number of things. So, and because it would be a show on vision, then sightlines and points of view would be, very important in an exhibition like that.
Right.
But if you're working, to do a solo show or a 2 or 3 person show with a living artist, and again, different curators have different approaches, but I'm from a school of thought that is very invested in, artists and artistic visions. So if I'm working closely with an artist, I have discussions on a number of different topics, and you deal with very different people. There's some artists who look at an exhibition as a very precise enterprise and have thoughts on what is important to them, who may even want to weigh in on layout issues. And there are other people who say, surprise me, I'm really curious to see what you're going to do with this material. So depending on who you're working with, you will have to use very different approaches. And I mean, there's always a delicate balance because, also, I think it's also hard for an artist to let artwork out of their own studio into the world, right?
It's hard?
It's hard, I think, for artists. I mean, you might say it's wonderful because you're selling something
and you're... the whole point.
Well, but I think it can also be hard because in the studio you can control everything. Let's say you're an artist, you're in your studio, you're working on a series of, say, sculptures, and you have this beautiful northern light, and all of a sudden the work is shown in a museum under incandescent lights, where you have
that produces anxiety for artists?
That can produce anxiety. I mean, it was an Ed Ruscha painting that I saw in someone's home, and it had this incredibly intense blue color, when I brought it into the museum and I hang it on the wall, it looked green because of the lights. It looked completely different. So you can have surprises like that. Right. And then you're trying to work with color filters and other things to get it back to where it should be, but there can be all sorts of surprises. And so for artists, I think it really depends. There's some people who have an increasingly strong, as artists, an almost curatorial vision for their work. And then they certainly want to kind of prescribe the spaces in which their work is exhibited, especially if it's a major exhibition in which they're kind of strongly invested. And there are other people who, are more open. We said earlier, are much more open.
Well, this will be a good point to take a break. We'll be right back. We are talking to Catharina Manchanda, who is the Curator of Contemporary Art at SAM. Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and we are talking to Catharina Manchanda at the Seattle Art Museum. So, Catharina, tell us, you have been with SAM now for 6 or 7 years.
That's correct.
So you've been here a while. Where are we going with contemporary art, presentation, and thinking at SAM? In your vision, I'm not talking as an institution, but you as a curatorial voice.
I mean, I would say there are two modalities. One is the kind of large organized exhibitions that, as we just discussed, each of them has kind of a different kind of approach. And then you have the modern and contemporary galleries. And of course, the Seattle Art Museum has, 9 curators, all in different fields. They all have a different vision for how they want to show artwork and their approaches to curatorial practice. But what's important to me in connection with how to showcase and curate with a permanent collection is I like to take a more thematic approach.
Right.
And as we were just saying, that lends itself to more exploration. And I think, museums for the longest time, and especially if you look at the history of modern and contemporary art, have been the focus of great scrutiny, rightly so, I think, especially if you think of leading models like the Museum of Modern Art in New York or other large national institutions, for the way in which historically exhibitions have been curated with a very strong chronological bent. And also for the, let's say, a focus on European-centric and North American ventures, rather than thinking of, say, modernisms plural, thinking more globally, thinking more about the arts of Asia or South America or other places. And returning back to our collection, of course, when you come to a museum, whether it's today, whether it's 5 or 10 years ago, you first of all inherit the collective knowledge that has led up to that point. I mean, there are very few institutions that really have such a vast collection that anything is possible. So I think what you want to do curatorially, and what excites me the most, is to pose different questions with the kinds of exhibitions that you're doing, with the material. So it means, not always showing the same material. It means not always showing, whatever the highlights of the collections might be, but trying to introduce different kinds of questions.
So let me echo some thoughts about how those of us located much more in the world of architecture and architectural history and theory have looked at the curation of modernism in museums. And I think there are two things that are of interest to me. One is, of course, the kind of landmark role that certain exhibits curated at places like MoMA, going back to Philip Johnson's, modernism exhibition, to later exhibitions, to the deconstructivist exhibition in architecture, have played a strongly authorial role in the discourse on architectural thinking. So there's that one kind of way in which museums have continued to play that role of authorial in the sense of authority as well. In architectural history now, and I think in art history also, in quite significantly, the story of the narrative of modernism, as you were starting to talk about just now earlier, has been significantly globalized, which is to say that it's no longer the narrative of the rising of this brilliant sun in Paris, which is sent around the world, or Germany, or wherever, but that in the crucible of the transnational movements of the colonial and the post-colonial world, modernism is seen as a kind of a multi-nucleated situation.
Quite, right.
So are the discourses of rethinking the modernism kind of part of your worldview here?
Yes, in part they are. I mean, the museum really prides itself also in breaking up the more monolithic stories by also connecting different parts of the collection. And that means collaborations between different curators, for instance.
Right.
I also like to bring, contemporary artists in a conversation with, let's say, earlier mid-century or earlier modern developments, if there is a meaningful connection to be made. So, I mean, some people like to see time capsules and pieces, but I find it much more interesting when you can have conversations that reach beyond those narrow confines, because oftentimes contemporary artists are continuing conversations or aesthetics or conventions that started much earlier, or they were trying to break with them, and you can show that visually in a space itself, and those are the moments that can be quite interesting.
So is global modernism a category in art thinking?
No, I think
not really.
That is not a helpful category. I mean, we think of course, modern developments across the globe. And, again, depending on different curators, there are people who would like to perhaps show parallels, in different countries. But oftentimes, I think there are then local developments that are really significant and important to understanding why certain things develop in different places. So, I mean, take Brazil and kind of a development post-war and investment in ideas coming out of geometric abstraction, and how that developed then in relationship to poetry, into completely unique forms of expression in that country compared to the path that the United States took post-war, with initially a great emphasis in kind of gestural abstraction. So different trajectories that develop, and I think it's really important to also look not only at the artists but at intellectuals and thinkers in different places.
Of the local milieus.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a translocal kind of a perspective. But how do you deal with the problem of influence in that discourse? Like, I mean, one classically assumes that, there are vectors of influence.
Yeah, that also is a problematic term. I think oftentimes has always to do with the perspective from which you're looking, right? When is something influence? When is somebody appropriating an idea, a style, even an image, in order to critique it or question it, or in order to kind of expand on a conversation? These seem like subtle distinctions, but they can be really significant depending on where you're standing from. So if you're standing, in the shoes of Clement Greenberg, you might be looking at Latin America and you think everything is just influenced by other ideas. If you're looking from the perspective of people, in Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, the conversation will structure itself very differently. So this notion of influence itself comes with almost ideas of hierarchy. So I think one has to be careful with that.
Definitely comes with ideas of hierarchy. I mean, so for instance, this is also an issue in Seattle. I have felt that we often worry constantly about whether we are the satellite of New York and whether we are a sort of a regionalized, influenced space.
Oh, this is an interesting conversation. Yeah, well, I would love to hear what you learned from your colleagues. But I think artistically, I mean, if we say look at contemporary art and artists living and working in the Pacific Northwest, it's interesting to speak with people here in Seattle and then speak to people in Vancouver, right? Which we're just 2.5 hours, away from each other, and they're very different attitudes. So a year or two ago, I had an interesting conversation with Ian Wallace, who's a great Vancouver artist who embarked on his career in kind of photography and painting. He's kind of using a hybrid mode in the late 60s, early 70s. And he said, when I asked him about the differences and asked him about how Vancouver kind of grew as an art center, he said for him personally, it was the difference between thinking you're in the middle of nowhere, which can be one point of view, or saying I'm redefining myself as a pioneer. I'm at the frontier, and if I adopt that viewpoint, that gives you much greater latitude and freedom to develop different kinds of ideas. And then the kind of
frontier
choices.
Avant-garde.
Well, no, but it's not about a manifesto necessarily, but it means something very different if you and your personal identity, if you say to yourself, gosh, I'm just too far away from artistic centers like New York or LA, and I feel I'm disadvantaged because of that, versus saying, I'm in a former pioneer town. I'm seeing myself at the furthermost frontier. What does that enable me to do artistically?
And
that can be a very liberating thought.
Sure, it can be. It can be. Now the issue becomes, you started by saying that's not how Seattle does it.
Well, I think it depends, artist to artist.
But in terms of the museum and showing, how do we say it? How do we present the sort of Northwest modernist legacy of this area in terms of this global spectrum? Yeah.
Well, my approach has been actually, because there's a real provincialism when people make a distinction between local and global, which I really dislike. So my approach has been, and I haven't done, a larger show yet, of just Northwest artists, but when I'm showing artists who are from the region or live and work here, I tend to think of them truly as equals to artists who work elsewhere. So I try not to make a distinction between somebody who works in Seattle compared to who works in New York or in India or anywhere else, as long as the ideas kind of speak to each other. So it's more a question of selection. So and so I don't like to label, say, a gallery the Northwest Art Gallery, because in our contemporary context, all the artists travel constantly. They have the ability through internet and so many resources to be very informed about what happens elsewhere. So those distinctions, kind of the assumption behind the idea of a very distinct regional approach seems to me rather outdated.
Right. And paradoxically, of course, Seattle is now at the center of the world in other theaters. Whether we like it or not, Seattle, like the Bay Area, with Amazon and all these other new world thinking modalities, is asserting itself in a way as never before. How is that identity, if you like, of Seattle, is that playing a role in your thinking about curatorial work today?
Yeah, I always think in terms of place and in terms of audiences, but what you were just saying about the geography, that's actually a point that's been playing out here in Seattle probably since the early 20th century, because if you look at Northwest modernists, Mark Tobey, Morris Graves and others, they early on looked towards Asia as a potential influence for themselves. And that's perhaps one of the biggest distinctions between a historical set of artists here in Seattle compared to Vancouver, where people didn't have that view towards Asia. And the Seattle Art Museum played a role in that because it started as a collection of Asian art, and the artists in part certainly also learned from the collections and what they saw there and the kind of aesthetics. So in that regard, that's not a new idea. And I would say it plays especially a large role institutionally for the Seattle Art Museum right now in the curatorial approach to contemporary Asian art. And that's something, we just hosted the Yayoi Kusama show, which is, of course, one example of a extremely well-known, highly celebrated Japanese artist. That was an exhibition that I was the in-house curator for at the Seattle Art Museum, but our curators of Japanese and Chinese art are venturing out and are going to develop their own programs on contemporary Asian art. And I think we'll see definitely some of that downtown, especially now while the museum at Volunteer Park that houses the Asian art collection undergoes a big renovation. But even more so, I think when the refurbished museum will open, there will be definitely great emphasis on contemporary art there as well.
But besides looking at Asia and across the borders, I mean, how are you responding to this sort of emergence of the digital supremacy here in Seattle?
Well, that's of course very topical if you think of all the companies here in Seattle. I think it permeates everything, and the museum is constantly thinking about that.
Mm-hmm, I'm sure.
So, you know, it's interesting because it really starts in the late 90s, and you have here in Seattle, you know, an artist such as Gary Hill, who had a big show at the Henry Art Gallery not long ago, very influential in the use of new technologies, videos, video installations, and kind of shaping and helping to define a new aesthetic and a new outlook and meaning for art. And that's certainly something that is ongoing. At the same time, what is happening now, of course, not only are artists at times working, you know, with or increasingly with the different media. And it's not just meaning that, you know, people use online platforms or that the end result is somehow time-based, or, you know, whether that's sound-based or whether that's digital video or something of that sort, but also the kind of processes and means that go into the production of an artwork is very much informed by, you know, technology, and from sketching to processing of images to composing.
I'm very interested to see how, I mean, we are the digital frontier of the world, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you were talking about frontiers earlier. So certainly this is the wild west of the digital today. we are sitting in it. And be curious to see how the art community and the performance arts, all the, you know, I think all the communities respond to that. I mean, of course, there's a big discussion about preservation and how the Seattle is changing and how it should or shouldn't change in response to our new pressures. But there's also the sort of other complementary discussion of how we can respond to our new frontier identity.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, one example very prominent on the facade of the downtown museum at the Seattle Art Museum is this incredible piece by Doug Aiken called Mirror, which opened several years ago with an incredible musical score. It was a collaboration with the symphony.
I was there for the opening.
And you were there for the opening, and it was truly exciting, I think, for all of us. And of course, this is a piece that, you know, is based, Doug Aiken, artist who's based in Los Angeles, was trying to conceive of a piece that is changing. So rather than having a video that's filmed and then the same sequence shows over and over again, this particular piece responds to various other environmental factors, whether it's the weather or it gets cues from what's happening in the street around it, the traffic, there might be a demonstration, it could be any number of things, season. So it then plays different sequences. It's like an ever-changing collage or montage, if you will. So here's one example, you know, where you have a very prominent embrace of new technologies on display. I think another, and of course this is something that's ongoing. I mean, we had a wonderful installation at the Olympic Sculpture Park dealing with climate change not this summer, the previous summer. Tommy Cotil was the artist, and she allowed you, it was a virtual tour you could take off the sculpture park, imagining in a rather surreal scenario what climate change is going to look like in the future with rising sea levels, and all of a sudden you have like crazy red tide sweeping, you know, all over the landscape. So, you know, using augmented reality software. So these are ways in which artists are using these tools at their disposal, and the museum is obviously trying to showcase examples of that work too. Another way in which the city as such could react and I'm still wondering what's going to happen. I think coming to Seattle, knowing about the big technology hubs here, I thought, and other colleagues also thought, oh, this must be an incredible city for showcasing new art forms,
yes, absolutely.
new media.
You would think.
You would think. But on arriving here, I realized that, and of course, why would I make that assumption in the first place? There is no such natural collection. I mean, first of all, the kind of people working in technology industries don't necessarily have to have a connection to art. I hope that's gradually developing, but, just like anything else, why...
Or they want to collect classics.
Or they might want to collect classics. But I think if we're looking for something that could change and that would make a huge difference, is, beyond the obvious and very generous sponsorship of many of those big corporations to arts and culture institutions in the city. But if you would have more individuals who would get invested in contemporary art and collect it, and whether that means collecting, these kind of avant-garde art forms, if you will.
Art incubator spaces.
Art incubator spaces.
Because we have all these incubator spaces. We need some art and architectural and design thinking incubator spaces.
But I mean, you raise an important point, and that is, we kind of tend to accept what's a given. You move into your house, your apartment, you decorate, you put on the wall whatever you put on your wall, and then after half a year, you don't really register anymore what's on your wall. You kind of accept that as that's the way it is. But it's, of course, very exciting to think about the potential of what is possible, of thinking, the white box is kind of a conceit of modernism, and we're still holding on to it, but we could, we can reimagine museum spaces as encounters in very different ways.
Yes.
There are tons of ideas, but it also comes with a price tag, and that tends to be very often the limitation. It's not for lack of ideas. So again, if there are partners interested in developing really visionary new approaches to architectural space in museums, they're great possibilities.
Next time I run a studio on a museum, we will bring you in as our fictional client or a real client.
I would love that.
And then the brief will be, you can't do a conventional museum. You have to imagine the future of the museum.
Oh, I would love to see what your students come up with.
Well, you will direct us. But I was very curious that earlier you were describing the Doug Aiken piece. Mm-hmm. And you described it as a quote-unquote piece. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you're really describing elevations in architecture and the skin of a building, right? It's very much an architectural work, is what I would say.
Absolutely, it's an architectural piece, but it also has a flow, right?
Of course it has a flow, but one can say that could be the future of architecture. What that piece does is it rethinks architecture, is one way to think about it, in terms of what is the facade of a building.
It's true, but he was also very careful in the development of Mirror, that's the name of that video sequence that plays on the facade of the downtown building, to steer away from the kind of editing techniques, sequences, aesthetics that might play out at Times Square, New York, where you have, the kind of liquid architecture, devised by, various commercial enterprises who essentially play the facades of all these
he was very
buildings.
careful to sort of almost make his work subservient to the already existing rhythms of the curtain wall, which is a good point of dialogue to start and say, how could, if the curtain wall designer was to work with an artist and say, how could we develop a system which would produce a dialogue of collision between those two requirements, and set up the facade of a museum as a gallery.
That would be fascinating, and I think that simply requires that when a building is under construction, that you would have an enlightened patron who would call in an artist, and then it could really be a symbiotic kind of a joint venture. It's of course very different when a piece of architecture is already completed and then an artist is invited in, because then you can't really modify the architecture anymore.
Or you would work with the facade in such a way that it's modifiable and that it's open for curation over time.
True.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Catharina. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
Thank you very much for having me this morning, Vikram.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. I'm Vikram Prakash, and our show's producer is Sadie Vechler. See you next time.